welcome to another piping hot, fresh edition of God is Not a Theory with Ken Fish. I'm your host, Grant Pemberton, and on today's episode, we have actually a returning guest. We don't have these that often, which is really great. You should feel very, very privileged right now.
I do actually. I listened to the. I think I'm catching the Father's episode now, so I'm only one or two behind. And you're right. There aren't many. I am honored. Thanks, guys.
I'm always here. Grant's always here.
That's true.
We and people don't, they don't care about me, but we're excited to talk about what you're doing, Putty. And I think a lot has changed since the last time that you were on here. And I read your, basically press release that you put out, and I got real excited. And I actually reached out to Ken. I was like, we have to have Putty on to talk about this next journey, because for my money, you're one of the best thinkers we have in the kingdom. And I love what kind of comes from you, from the Lord. And so I'm excited, and I think you're on the right track, and it's really fun. So thanks for joining us. And I've been looking forward to this conversation. So, and Ken, always thank you for joining us as well. I'll let you talk too during this time, even though I'm excited.
Well, Putty, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you.
Oh, thank you, man. I'd do this every week if it made sense.
I get it. I get it. I'm trying to remember when we met. I know who introduced us. It was Rip and Phil.
Mm-hmm.
But it's probably been 7 or 8 years, I think, since we were first introduced.
I think that's right. It was one of
you were younger and thinner.
Hey, not
this
wrong.
Is the pot calling the kettle black.
Not wrong. Yeah, it was at one of those Vineyard Nationals in Anaheim.
Yeah. Okay.
I don't remember which year, though.
Yeah. Well, it's been a while, but anyway, it's been fun to watch your life develop. And actually, that's a good place for us to start. You've been on this podcast in the past, as Grant mentioned. The last time we spent a lot of time talking about particle physics and trying to think about quantum theory and things of the spirit. And by the way, that podcast was wildly popular, although I'm not sure everybody fully understood it because you're a physicist and they're not.
Sure.
So it really is like rocket science, what you've been trained in. But you are also the founder of the School of Kingdom Ministry. You founded the school, you wrote all of the instructional material and manuals, and you led it for, I don't know exactly, but around a decade, right?
It's just about exactly a decade, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So you've now transitioned out of the School of Kingdom Ministry, and it's in other hands. And you talk to us a bit about what are you doing now?
Yeah. So the whole journey has been really interesting. When COVID landed, the Lord started talking to me basically about a new season. And, he kind of did what he does, where he's like, we're going to head towards something new. And I said, what is it, Lord? And he said,
wait. You got a word about the Great Reset? You're a prophet. Nobody told us.
Well, once the world gets shook up like that, it's not too hard. It's not too hard. Although I don't know if you know this, Ken. Maybe we've talked about this, maybe not. January maybe 11th of that year of 2020, I preached and I stood on the stage. It's recorded. I can give you the video. And I said, I asked the Lord for a word for this year. I've never done it before. And he gave me the word chaos. And I don't like that. And 2 months later, kaboom. So anyway, the Lord started
like
talking
the Big Bang or something, right?
Yeah.
You're used to studying things like this.
Yeah. So the Lord starts talking about change. Over the course of the next year, it becomes clear this means leaving Champaign-Urbana, where I was, leaving the church I was on a team of, passing along School of Kingdom Ministry, all these layers he sort of gradually reveals to me over the next year. Meanwhile, he doesn't tell me anything about where we're going, anything about what we're doing. And after 9 months of trying to arm wrestle him, I eventually realized, I'm like, oh, you don't intend to tell me anything until I'm in motion. So I guess I just need to pick somewhere to go. And so I was living downstate Illinois. I grew up in the Chicago area. I thought I'll come to Chicago. That'll be a good discerning place. I've got lots of connections still here. Family's not far away. Most of them are still connected to Champaign-Urbana in some way. So we came up to Chicago and I started listening. I helped a friend out at a church who had a campus, which I served as an interim pastor at for a little while. Just recently concluded that. And all along the way, God, what are we doing? What are we doing? What are we doing? And, you know, it's kind of one of those things where the Lord eventually made clear. He was like, hey, you know, all those conversations we've been having about like the future of the church and like how church isn't really working for your generation anymore. And you know how you have like all these ideas about how that could be different. You know, maybe that was for a reason. Maybe you're supposed to do something with that. And so, you know, I realized like, oh, yeah, I was kind of sort of trying to avoid that a little bit or something. I hadn't owned the fact that I knew that I had to do something with that. So it became clear, like, this is what you're doing. And so, you know, my conviction is actually that the way that we do church in the West is hitting or has hit its expiration date. It is not designed for the world that we live in anymore. And as a result, it feels archaic, it feels out of touch, it feels out of date. It is largely ineffective, ineffective in increasing measure in each generation that goes by. And I know I'm not among dissenters when I say it cannot be that Jesus has failed. It cannot be that his kingdom has failed. So what is happening here? And what I would say is the fit between the church and the world the church is meant to reach is getting further and further and further. And that's the sense of tension. That's the sense of failure. So I've been talking with the Lord about this for 5-6 years. And he said, all right, we're going to go do that now. And so, so I said, oh, okay. What does that mean? What does that look like? And I surveyed a ton of different options. And the conclusion I came to, for better or for worse, is the only way I can do that is to plant a church in a new shape. I can't do it by proxy. I can't train somebody else to do the thing. It's like, I can see it lives in here. And the only way to make it happen is to go do it with my own life. Like, you guys know how that is. And so that's the journey that I've been on. I actually think in terms of church pioneering more than church planting, because church planting kind of communicates I'm starting a new church. For me, the main thing is actually not starting a new church. I'm not like, there needs to be another church in Phoenix. I'm like, there needs to be a new way of church. And the only way that I can think of to make a new way of church is to just start with a blank canvas and build one from scratch. And so I'm church planting so I can do church pioneering. And that's what I'm heading towards. That's what I'm moving towards Phoenix to do.
Now you're calling this Church Next, which is or at least that's some of the language you're using. Maybe that won't be the ultimate final name to it.
Yeah, probably not.
But it's an unusual language set, although nowadays people do kind of remix words and repurpose them. Right. A lot of churches are abandoning the old denominational titles, you know, the Third Lutheran Church of Poughkeepsie or the, you know, First Baptist Church of, I don't know, Chicago or whatever. We see names like the Father's House. That's one church that I visit up in Washington State most years. Everybody knows of Elevation and Upper Room. Another person I know has a church called Living Edge. So there are a lot of names like this that are floating around. How did you come by this name and what's it intended to signify?
Yeah, that's a great question. The name actually precedes the idea of church planting. because as I toyed around with all these different ideas about there needs to be a new way to do church, I realized I needed some kind of label or handle for what I was describing as perhaps the next iteration of what church may look like and how it may function. And so Church Next actually became the language I used for sort of the next iteration of church. Will it be the name we continue to use? I don't know. The more I use it functionally, the more it feels just slightly hubristic or something like that. I do want to have some term that refers to the methodology of church and have that be probably a different thing from the name of the church itself. And the name of the church itself, I don't really know. That's a subject of conversation and prayer still. Part of the thing I'm trying to do is, again, not get boxed in by terms and labels. I'm trying to retain as blank a canvas as possible. And when you're trying to like not just plant a new church with a different culture, but you're like trying to scramble the organizational model and those things, just the blanker the canvas, the better. And so I'm thinking about calling it something just really simple, really clear, but something that points to the idea that we're moving away from church as an organization into church as an ecosystem. And that's kind of one of the mental hooks of we're moving away from organized thing into the sort of living, growing, and dynamic thing.
Now, when I hear the term ecosystem, I think words like interdependent, mutuality. Actually, probably no piece of it can thrive on its own, although that's not a word, it's a phrase. But yeah. Anyway, you get the idea. I think of words like probably when you think of ecosystem, things in balance, maybe sustainable. That might be another word that maybe not self-sustaining, but sustainable. Right. There's some sort of I think the word is feedback loop, that if things get out of order, they kind of, correct themselves. I don't know. There's probably some other things that go with it. Healthy is probably another word that most people think of as an ecosystem. I guess you could have an unhealthy ecosystem as well, but
right.
We tend to think of like nature in balance as it was before mankind really messed it up. Is that the kind of thing you're trying to convey? And what will be some of the hallmarks of that when you bring it to life?
Yeah, no. So some of them are causes and some of them are sort of effects and all of that. An organization is something that has planned and regulated interdependencies and synergies. An ecosystem is something that has like not pre-planned and pre-regulated synergies, right? Like nobody's the boss of the forest. Like every tree is doing its own tree thing, every animal is doing its own animal thing. And yes, there is like synergies that happen in the middle of that, but it's not a like hierarchical planned synergy. And that's the difference between an organization and an ecosystem, one of many differences. And so, yes, interdependence is a big one, but also there's a sort of like interdependence coupled with high autonomy that comes together in an ecosystem. And you hopefully actually can create interdependence in a healthy organization. That's usually what the bosses and managers are trying to do, right? You work together and you'll do more together. But what we're trying to do is actually move away from church as being run by a centralized authority structure. Now, I think you need healthy feedback loops, you need accountability, you need leadership, you need all these things that you're talking about. But somehow mysteriously, those effects can exist, at least in nature, the way God makes things, as you even pointed out. Somehow those things seem to be able to exist in nature without there needing to be centralized planning. And what I want to do is I want to say, okay, is it possible to create a church that isn't centralized in that way, but rather those things that we tend to centralize actually get pushed into each and every person in a decentralized way, and let them, like an ecosystem, sort of grow and develop their own synergies and interdependences, but keep the impetus for action and all of these things at the bottom level, rather than scaling the pyramid as we tend to do, where like responsibility grows towards the top, but also that comes at the cost of limiting the things that happen at the bottom. And this is what has always been the thing that one of the things I learned out of School of Kingdom Ministry. I saw about 3 or 4 years in that churches did not have a meaningful way to mobilize the people that we had switched on. They were too kingdom oriented, and the church would be like, well, would you want to greet people at the door, or we need help with the kids ministry? And they're like, I want to cast out demons. And it's just like not satisfying. But what wound up happening is the bottom up initiative was too large that the top down leadership didn't know how to steer it anywhere. And so either the bottom up people handle that poorly and you wind up with church divisions and things like that, or they don't handle it poorly, but then the fire goes out. And 2 years later, they're kind of just like, well, yeah, that was a cool mountaintop experience, and all of that. And so that was one of the early things that really got to me. I was like, why is it the way we structure our churches is limiting how much kingdom can flow through people? Like, that feels so wrong. Like, isn't that the point here? Like, we're undermining the very thing this thing exists to do. And so, yeah, I want to see if we can do it in a different manner that will be, I don't know, we'll see.
So Putty, just bouncing off of that a bit, I've been through an interesting journey as well since 2020 as far as church goes, and reimagining, rethinking, and all of that. And and since I have learned about a lot of different things. I have a lot of friends that are in the kind of the DMM type movement. How do you see this discipleship making movement? For those that don't know what that is, how do you see this fitting into that? Do you think it's something different? Do you think it's going to share some of those things? Because they have a lot of those sort of similar decentralized type.
Yeah, I love that
ideas.
question. Yeah, I love that question, Grant. And I often get this question. There are certainly some similarities around the idea of decentralization. I actually think DMM gets a ton right, but one of the reasons I think that DMM thus far seems to be successful in the majority world, far beyond its degree of success in the Western world. Part of that is, I think there are extra layers in the Western world that are relevant to us that DMM doesn't factor in. So let me give you an example. Here's one concrete thing I'm hoping to do with our church ecosystem thing. One of the threats that could harm the decentralization is the way that finances flow through a system. Finances tend to be a centralizing factor, because if there's a pot of money, whoever's in control of that pot of money has the power, right? That's how it works. And there's actually even some fascinating studies that have been done on, there's a fascinating book. You guys probably have at least heard of it, if not read it. The Starfish and the Spider. You guys read that book? It's a business book, right?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it.
Yeah, it was a fascinating study in there where they were talking about how the Apache Indians functioned as a decentralized society. And that's why the American settlers couldn't defeat them for like over 100 years. And the only way they eventually defeated them is by giving them resources, which made their society centralized, and then they could beat it. So that's just a fascinating little historical study. But suffice all of that to say, if finances are centralized, then you're not doing a decentralized church. And so what DMM does, so far as I've been able to see, is mostly just avoid finances. It's sort of like, hey, money, be good with God and your money. That's kind of like DMM's line on it, right? Now, the problem with that, as I see it, is, well, there's a few. First of all, God is not apathetic to how our money works. And so if money and God are like not closely synced in our church system, I can just kind of look at that and I go, discipleship feels weird. But beyond that, I would say this. I don't know about you guys, but I actually want to be able to use money and pool money to like meaningfully affect my community. Like if I have a church that has a group of people and we have money that we want to allocate towards the kingdom, like I want to be able to go to the mayor and be like, we've got $10,000. How can we use this for your city in Jesus' name? Like I want to be able to do that. And so I think if you don't have some layer of something like that, it doesn't work well. So anyway, how does this work? Well, here's one thing we're dreaming about. What if, rather than having one centralized pot of money, in the ecosystem, there is some conditions, simple conditions that a group needs to be able to satisfy to be able to receive giving from the members of the church. A couple of simple things, nothing super complicated. But what this does then is we say, okay, we've got some simple structure. We'll just call it a circle. And that circle could be a home group. It could be an outreach ministry. It could be an itinerant. It could be, Ken Fish's itinerant ministry. It could be, whatever else. It could be a church plant. It could be a zillion different things. But in our ecosystem, there exist these circles. And these circles can have money. And when someone gives to this church, they don't dump money in a pot. They go, here's my $500. I want 100 of it to go there, 200 of it to go there, 300, whatever, 250 to go there. They actually give the money into the circles, not into some pot. But then each of these circles has to be self-sustaining and self-governing and actually has to use that money for kingdom means. And so what this means is if you're a home group attender and the Lord says, hey, half of your money that you give should go to your home group. Now we're having a conversation at the end of every month, like, hey, we've got $800. How are we going to spend this money for the kingdom of God? And it's like, well, I don't know, my neighbor down the street just lost their job. Maybe we could go give her $500. And so then what's happening is the people in the group are going, knocking on the neighbor's door going, hey, we heard you just lost your job. Here's $500. This is from us, but really it's from Jesus. And he's amazing. And we want you to know, we'll be praying for you. Can we come back in 2 weeks and can you let us know? And she's sobbing because, oh my goodness, this is amazing. And we're praying for her or whatever, all of that's happening. But like it's been initiated and executed not by a staff, by the normal people who are like seeing real kingdom needs and really doing them. And then that is like spread out through this whole ecosystem. That level of like what that does for your personal discipleship, where do I give? How do we allocate this money for the kingdom? Like that's beautiful. Like that's amazing, right? But I don't see any layers of that kind of thing happening in DMM. In DMM, the Bible study portion is empowered and decentralized. Like go study the Bible, people, go get your hands on people. But there's missional pieces there that go beyond like evangelism and discipleship that I think you can form these interdependence bits on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. And I love that idea of what would a small group do or a home group do if at the end of the month they said, we got $1,000, like, what do we do with this? What a great, I mean, to me, that's sort of turning it on its head. I love that. And I think that's what excited me so much when Ken told me that's what you're doing, is because you're just so smart, Putty. And so I know you've probably got these manuals that you're creating, and they're going to look real cool. And if anybody can do this, I think it's probably you.
Thanks, man. We'll see. I'm excited about it. We'll see what God does with it.
So I'm just thinking about what you're sharing, and I'm thinking back to the Vineyard Anaheim. It's been a long time ago. Now, officially, there is no more Vineyard Anaheim, I guess. Right. But that church from back then, that was, under John Wimber's able care. As I think about that, we had kinship groups, is what we called them then. That's a dated term, but that was the language we used at that time. And John gave us fairly decentralized ability to run our groups as we chose. Mm-hmm. They had a very few minimal guidelines. You could kind of imagine what some of them would be. You couldn't teach against the church. You couldn't, we don't want any child molestation going on. I mean, it's fairly obvious stuff. But there was a lot of autonomy for the home group leaders, kinship group leaders. And then I don't remember how often it was. I think it eventually settled into quarterly meetings for the kinship group leaders to come together, and there'd be some sort of a, group exercise or something. But there was nothing that would have prevented us from, taking an offering every week in our kinship groups if we wanted to, or setting a basket by the door if we wanted to. Right. It might be to just pay for the brownies and coffee that we were having each week at the end of kinship group. It might have been that if we saw a need in the community, we could resource it in the way that you just described with the hypothetical unemployed woman. It could have been that we used that money maybe for, in my kinship group, we couldn't keep the size of the group down. And so we literally destroyed our host's home, wore out the carpets, damaged the walls, dirt everywhere. The couches and chairs became threadbare. So twice we completely redid the downstairs of their home.
Wow.
With the offering money that came in, because, it's not that different from when you've got a church facility and Right. You've got to maintain that. It's just that we were meeting in a home. So I was thinking about all that you were saying, and I was thinking, well, we did this and it worked really well. So Right. That leads me to ask, is this not happening elsewhere? Am I so out of touch that I don't realize that this has gone away? Because that's the only way I understand to do home
Right.
groups.
Right. Well, I think so. Well, yes, I'm sure there are people who are doing these kinds of things. The balance, right, is that, okay, so I wasn't in Vineyard Anaheim at the time, so I'm speculating here. But
Putty, you will always come short in the kingdom of heaven as a result. There's just
wow, telling it like it is. Love it.
It's so fun sparring with friends.
Yeah. This, as if you can't tell, this is not just a professional relationship here.
That's right.
We consider each other good friends, and we communicate often. The question, right, is like, to what extent is a kinship group an offshoot of a more centralized thing, right? And to what extent is that being steered by a centralized thing and or not, and whatever? If the value really was empowerment and autonomy, which seems like what I would have understood the values to be in the Vineyard in the 80s, it probably would have functioned very, very similarly. What I want to do is actually structure it that way from the get-go. So it's not like there's this other centralized organization that it kind of technically belongs to. No, it's like actually the organization is composed of those. And like the Sunday service isn't planned by some centralized staff. It's actually the coming together of these things and the jointly like Ephesians 4, resourcing each other kind of from one to another, because it's like God's doing something over there that needs to spread, and God's doing this over here and that needs to spread. And so it's actually sort of building it with those blocks in a different pattern, if that makes sense. But much of the behavior could be pretty similar in the right context, I think.
Well, and I think too, probably at Vineyard Anaheim, even though I wasn't there either, they probably did take an offering at Sunday, and they probably did expect the tithe to go towards that.
Right. Paying a building, paying a staff, all of that. Right. Right.
And so what you're saying is that's not necessarily the case potentially.
Yeah. No, exactly right. So for example, one of the things our team told me, we talked about it, and they said, Putty, we don't want the leftovers of your energy. We want you giving 100% of your employment time towards this as quickly as we can. So in a decentralized financial system, there's no pot that's paying my salary. So what I become is I actually become one of these buckets where now I've got some group of people who their job is to be like, no, Putty's still good. His marriage is checking out. He's like, he loves Jesus. He didn't start preaching Buddhism when we weren't looking, I've got some people whose job it is to sort of check me and to say, you are authorized on behalf of this community to be a preacher of the gospel. And then I act as one of the buckets in this community to raise my own salary. And so people can give to me, but they don't have to. And that actually puts me in a place of really living by faith, because I'm like, well, the Lord's got to provide for me. And that's just how it's going to go. And I'm not going to have some budget where I'm like, well, we'll cut this because I got to keep being paid. Like, that's not how it's going to work. So yeah, once you start getting into the nuts and bolts of it, it's like, oh, I'm more vulnerable here. I'm really more vulnerable. I can tell that as I'm raising the money, but it's also like growing me and making me trust God more. And I'm seeing God show up in it in a way that is different. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. So
this sounds to me like this sounds to me like a form of blockchain applied to the church, right? Because this silo and that silo, they can't necessarily replicate or infiltrate each other, even though they're related as part of the same value chain.
You picked that up, did you, Ken?
What's that?
I said you picked that up, did you, Ken?
Yeah, maybe you should call it blockchain church instead of church next. Yeah, that loses the hubris idea, but everybody will come thinking you've got a cryptocurrency to sell.
Well, and I've thought crypto church too. There are certainly relationships, but that's the point, though, right? Remember, I started the whole thing saying the shape of the way we do church is not the shape that our world is moving toward. And you just identified a shape. Blockchain is a shape. That's a shape that exists in this form of the world. And what I want to do is pioneer and try and find some shape of the church that's native to that shape of the world. So if you're like, well, that sounds like blockchain, I'm like, good, then I'm on the right track.
And the thing that's interesting about what you're saying, and I quote this verse all the time. I usually don't quote it verbatim. I give a updated rendering of it. But Jesus said to his disciples, the kings of the earth lord it over their subjects, and they delegate that authority to their lieutenants, who then exercise that authority on their behalf. And you can't do it this way.
Right.
Or whoever would be great among you must serve the others. And so somewhere along the way, I fear that message has been lost or diluted dramatically. It sounds to me as though what you are contemplating is to put in structural impediments to creating a hierarchical system that is, in the end, opposed to what Jesus said he wanted to see the church look like.
Yeah.
And hopefully that retards the intrinsic tendency of human beings to arrogate power to themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I want to build a platform that supports the ecosystem. And then I'll take my role in the ecosystem and I'll do everything I can, but everybody else is going to be doing the same. That's my goal.
So let me ask like a functional question. Does that mean like would one be able to expect a traditional Sunday type service, or would it be this decentralized home groups meeting in different places all over?
I love this. This is so good. Yeah. So I believe it's very important for the saints to gather, and I don't think it would be wise to forsake a weekend type experience.
It would also be unbiblical. I just want to point that out.
Yeah, it would be unbiblical and unwise. And but I do think the shape of that gathering is going to look very different, because the point, as I said, the point of how these circles interact with each other is really it's a kind of a giving and receiving type thing, right? Giving and receiving is such a big deal in the kingdom. I don't think we talk about this enough. We're like, Ken, I actually receive you as a gift to me in some ways in the church that I have stepped into massive grace just because I've received you. Just because I'm like, the Lord has put this on you. I see that, I receive that. And now all of a sudden I can operate in some things I couldn't do before. I think that's true of these circles as well. And the New Testament contemplates that. It talks about them in terms of the temple, right? It says we're each individually a temple of the Holy Spirit. But Paul writes to the Ephesians, you Ephesians are a temple. Oh, and by the way, the whole church is a temple. Like there's this kind of this idea of, it's like those nesting Russian dolls. I can't remember what they're called, matryoshka dolls or something like that, where it's like, it's got the doll and the doll and the doll and the doll. It's kind of the same thing. There's like temples of temples of temples of temples. And each of these little circles is actually a temple. Like God lives in that thing and God's doing specific things in that thing. And when the church comes together, these circles have a chance to receive one another, to be like, hey, like this small group is doing community amazingly. Like, let's receive the thing in community that God's doing there. This group is doing an incredible job reaching the poor or the homeless, and so what I'm seeing it being is more of a co-created experience where these circles are co-creating something together. And it will be probably more fluid and more dynamic and less structured and planned. Although you need enough structure that it's not just falling apart or chaos or unclear what to do, right? And that's where I really plan to try and leverage this stuff, technology, because it's really technology that's empowering these new shapes in the first place. There's going to have to be a component of how this weaves supported with a technological platform kind of in the middle of it too. And I see that becoming important, for example, with a Sunday service where maybe on Sunday, we're all come together, we're doing our thing, and somebody goes, I'm doing it. I'm getting baptized today. Bang. And now that just got added to the agenda. We just got a baptism right here, right now. In 20 minutes, we're dunking so-and-so. There's actually no reason we can't do that sort of flexible, fluid thing. We have the technological tools yet. We're just not really trying. So that's the kind of thing that I'm envisioning, if that makes sense.
Is that why when you get to Arizona, your stated intention is to plant your church close to ASU because you want to be near the dynamism of a younger target community, or is there something else going on with that?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to drill my way from the metro to a specific location. So I'm looking at a lot of different things there. The reason why Phoenix is for a few reasons. Number one, it's somewhat prophetic in the sense that I'm like, I don't believe that the church in the West is done. It might need to rise from the ashes, but I don't think it needs to be done.
Yeah.
But Phoenix, so far as I can tell, has a few other major things going for it. Number one, it's the fastest growing large city in America and has been for a decade. So if you're trying something new, easier where it's growing than where it's shrinking, right? But more importantly,
hey, Putty, I have a word for you. The Lord's sending you to Detroit.
No, I don't receive it. I don't.
Never mind that growth thing.
That's another spirit talking.
Keep going.
Probably even more important than that, from the research that I've been able to see, I think Phoenix is leading the country in innovation in the social sectors. The Phoenix city government has actually been the subject of multiple case studies in terms of how they're leading the city innovatively. ASU has a center for innovation in community development, I think is what it's called. And it has all of these interesting branches, including innovation in nonprofits, innovation in like all of these different areas. To say nothing of the fact that ASU itself is consistently ranked the most innovative university in America, outpacing whatever else you'd expect, MIT, Stanford, et cetera. So there's some kind of real innovative thing happening there in terms of how people are coming together and organizing and doing that. And I think, honestly, a lot of that's rooted in the fact that much of the growth of that community, about 50%, has happened since the internet. So like, it's actually having a chance to come of age in the time frame of this kind of new shape of the world, which no other major metro has. New York's been around way too long. LA's been around Chicago, where I'm at now, way too long. Phoenix is actually growing in the time frame where it can take the new shape. And that's why I'm like, that's the place to try it with church too. Let's do it.
Wow. I love the way you're even thinking about this. I mean, all of this is really a reflection of your own tolerance for risk, your background as a scientist, hypothesis development, hypothesis testing, things that contribute to those hypotheses. I mean, this is going to be a very interesting thing to see how this comes together. I mean, I love it. I love it. Is there anything else particularly about ASU that drew you? I mean, you and I talked about it, but I mean,
right.
You kind of targeted Phoenix. How did you get the sense that Phoenix might be the area? Was it all of this only, or did an angel appear to you? Did you have a dream? What else was going on there?
Yeah, no, there were a bunch of layers that I weighed. I kept wanting an angel. I was like, Lord, we could make this quick.
Yeah.
But I don't know that I feel like I ever had anything really clearly, overtly supernatural that did it. So some of it was actually cultural analysis of the country. You ever read this book, Ken?
Yes.
American Nations. So I read this one. You can see how many notes I've got on it there, right? I read this one early and identified, if you're not familiar, I should say for our podcast listeners, there's a book called American Nations. The author is hypothesizing that the North American continent has 11 regional cultures that all live on the continent and have a different set of values and outlook on life and are kind of vying for political power over the course of the country. I read that and I came to the conclusion that many places in America are a bad place to try this. Mostly because their ideology is already fixed. And in fact, it's even weaponized in Christianity. So I was pretty...
Wait, say that again.
Many places in America would be a bad place to try because their cultural outlook and ideology is already fixed. It's not flexible. And in fact, it's locked in place in a regional dispute, which largely at this point correlates with far left versus far right. And within the context of those areas, Christianity is often weaponized as one of the elements of their version of America, which they're trying to advocate for in the context of our country. So, you have you have two different versions of the church that are pretty strongly locked in. And what happens is, if I were to go in an area where one version or the other of that church is kind of the focus of that area, and I try and do something different, what 80+% of people will say is they'll go, you're doing something that's not what I'm used to. You're doing the opposite. So now you're an enemy. You're the version of Christianity I'm trying to squash. And I'm like, I don't want to go there. That's going to be a bad idea. So I ruled off some parts based on that kind of analysis. I had a conversation actually with Leif Hetland early on. And when we had talked, and one of the things he told me, which I in the moment recognized to be the voice of the Lord, was he said, go to an area where you have a hub airport, where you don't have a connecting flight. Go to a hub airport city. You will need it. You won't even be able to understand how big a difference it'll make in your life.
That's right.
And so in the moment I was like, this is the Lord speaking. Okay, well, that shortens the list, right? I mean, pick the 3 major airlines. You got 35 cities, maybe. Take those 35 cities, cross a bunch of them off with American nations. We're already down to less than 10 places, So then you start diving into the cities. What are they like and culture? And then eventually I went out there the first time to Phoenix. Once it was starting to look like, oh, this might be the place. I went out there and, this was probably the most supernatural of all the things. We went the worst possible time, first weekend in August. It's 115 degrees.
Yep, that's Phoenix.
Every single day. This is the worst time you go to Phoenix.
Yeah.
Right? I go out there. To make matters worse, I get sick like 2 days before the trip. So when I land, we have a fever. Like I have a fever in Phoenix, 115 degrees. We brought a whole family out there to see what it's like. I'm looking at this. I'm like, this is the worst, right? Somehow, all those factors included, it still winds up being the best family vacation we've ever had. I don't even know how. I'm like, that doesn't seem possible that this could be a great family experience. Best family vacation we've ever had. And that made me go, oh, okay, hold on here. Like that should have been the worst family vacation we ever had. And it was the best. And so I came back just in terms of the process of decision making. I went out there having done all this research, all this, whatever. We get there. I'm like, oh, this feels right. And we have this great family vacation. I come back and we say, okay, Lord, I went out there asking you to tell me if it was Phoenix. Now I'm asking you to tell me if it's not. Like we now have a window where I'm saying, God, I really think this is you in this. Everything is lining up. I don't know what more I could be asking for, honestly, but I'm going to give this time frame. I need you to give me a solid no. So send the angel to tell me no if I'm wrong, now or whatever. And so there were some further layers with that kept playing their way out. But that was kind of the structure of the decision-making process, if that makes sense.
It makes a lot of sense. I actually want to just insert something here. I mean, I mainly want you to be the talker, but a lot of what you were describing as your process was what collectively in a business environment, Grant and I both have MBAs, we would call this market research.
Yeah.
The Vineyard used to advocate for this. I don't know how good we were at it because a lot of our people didn't necessarily have the analytical skills or the training to know how to do it well. I think people tried, and maybe in some cases it worked, in some cases it didn't. But the thing that interested me about the way you described this is, I mean, everybody knows I'm a charismatic and I, teach on the things of the Spirit, and I'm all for that stuff. And I want more of it. But, I had training as a scientist before I became, analytically trained in matters of religion. And then I went to business school. What I've seen is that a lot of times people are looking for that angelic experience. And if they don't get it, they don't really know what to do. And as you were saying this, I was reminded of the prophet Daniel. And he says that, I should be able to quote it, but I can't right now. Anyway, when Darius the king came to power, he was looking through the books and he mentions the scroll of Jeremiah, which already Jeremiah had been canonized within the Jewish community. They knew it was legitimate scripture, the word of the Lord. And it's been, and if you do the math on the passage, he says the year that Darius came to power, and then we know when Jerusalem fell to the Babylonians, and we know that Persia overtook Babylon, and you can back into all these numbers if you know your way around the history. So it works out that it's exactly 6 years before the reconstruction order is given. And so Daniel did a very analytical process like you did. It was a different analytical process, and he didn't have books like, these Nations of America, and he didn't have any of that. But what he had was a scripture that he really meditated on, and he realized in 6 years everything's going to change. And so he began praying into that, and out of that comes this incredible prophetic release that results in not only the building of the temple, but the birthing of 2 prophetic ministries, Haggai and Zechariah. And with it, the emergence of, he's not a king, but he's the governor. So to call him, he's like Denethor in the Lord of the Rings. This man named Zerubbabel. All of that comes about because Daniel went through an analytical process. And it's only later that an angel comes and says, by the way, you were praying and I was sent to you, but it took 21 days to get through because we had this battle in the heavens that you knew nothing about. But there you go. And I think the thing that's noteworthy about this is, I think for many Christians, we've come to this place where if it isn't like this overtly supernatural thing, it's not somehow valid. It's not okay. Right. And yet when you got there and you did your cross analysis with these various pieces, you narrowed it down to 35 cities based on Leif's input. Then you narrowed it down to about 10 based on how that matched with the book. And so this was the one that you felt led to, and you go there and it's like ding, 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 ding. Everything drops into place and you go, oh, God was leading me after all, even though I didn't have the angel come that I wanted to have come. And I think that's really important for people to realize that, sure, sometimes he does lead by the angel. And sometimes he leads because he's given us a good, sound mind, and he expects us to use it for his glory.
Yeah. It's interesting, because Ken, we're both like, I'm so bought in on the revelation of the Lord and the leading of the Spirit. Like, it's interesting. At some point I realized, I was like, oh, it would actually take less faith for me if an angel just showed up and told me, which is interesting. Cause like at one point I would have been the other way around, it would have been like, hey, the Lord can lead through my sound decision-making and maybe the Lord will speak by revelation, And so there's that sort of learning curve. You get used to it, you begin to trust it and whatever. Well, now I'm like, oh, I'm in a different place. Like if the Lord just would have said, go to Phoenix, I would have been like, boom, I'm in, faith wrapped around it, but because he didn't say that and he led in this other way, it like actually grew me in faith more, where I'm like, wow, God, like you're really involved with a lot more layers than I can see. Like you're around so many corners and behind so many doors that I'm just not tracking with. I only see the obvious stuff and think it's you. You're working in so many ways. And so it's actually really developed my faith sort of the inside out way.
Well, again, you said the Lord essentially forced you to start walking and then I'll show you. That's what he did with Abraham. Abraham's known as the man of faith, not a man of faith, the man of faith. And I wonder how much of that was built because of the just keep walking, Abraham, just keep walking. When you get there, I'll tell you you've arrived. Oh, you blew it there. Don't worry, Abraham. We're going to get it back on track. Just keep going. Yeah. I mean, that is part of the ecosystem of faith. And I don't think we talk about that nearly enough in the church. So your life is becoming a parable.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's always fun, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's important that everyone that's listening to this just rewind this for the last 5 or 10 minutes and listen to that again, because I mean, pastorally, I don't know how that I deal with, that they're constantly wondering what is the will of the Lord for their life and how do they move forward, and it's typically or paralysis by analysis, and so it's so important, I think, to hear that. I think we've been paralyzed by this. The safest place to be is at the center of the will of God, and it's caused us to just like but I mean, you're right. I mean, it doesn't take faith if I know the answer. Like the faith comes from not knowing what's going to happen, and I maybe 3 or 4 times a week, I have to tell this to people that are trying to figure out what they're supposed to do with their life or whatever. Mm-hmm. And so if you're listening to this, you can just maybe bypass several difficult years and start taking a step towards what you feel like the Lord is doing. I love it.
Yeah. For me, it's fascinating. So much of this process has been, I realized, I was like, Lord, I feel like I don't know how to make grown-up decisions with you. I know how to make the simple ones, like the right, wrong, duh, that's easy, right? The go here and do this, like where you take all the work of establishing clarity. Yeah, I know how to do that. But like, I sort of feel like when you get your driver's license and then there's this whole new set of decisions where you're like, oh, there are a different set of decisions I don't know how to navigate. I realized I was like, somehow I never got that, Lord. And at no point along the way did the Lord really reduce that clarity. But what happened was fascinating. I would say, Lord, what are we doing? Where should I go? Where should I go? Silence. He wouldn't tell me anything. It would just be like bounce off the wall. But if I would ask the Lord, how do I decide where to go? He'd speak, bang, crystal clear. Here's how you make that choice. So he was very verbal about the process of the decision-making, but at no point would he like lift the decision-making responsibility off of me. And what was fascinating was I finally got clarity when I was like, oh, the Lord is in how this decision is being made more than he's actually in this specific outcome of this decision. Yeah. So what I need to do then is just say, Lord, here's the process. Here's what it's going to look like. I'm inviting you to speak. I'm like, I want to hear you. You can say anything you want with this process, which is the one you gave me in the first place. And then once that's done, I'm going to say, okay, I'm trusting the Lord has said everything he needs to say. Now I'm going to make this decision. And I'm going to say, God, you got 2 weeks to tell me I'm wrong or I'm moving forward, and God was there's so much grace in that. It was shocking, actually. And it really grew me up in faith where now I'm like, oh, I feel comfortable making a decision of this level with the Lord in confidence and in faith. It's really been profound for me.
I think everything you just said will be immensely freeing for thousands of our listeners who are caught in anxiety and unable to make a decision about everything from who to date, who to marry, where to go to college, what job to take, what house to buy. It just goes on. And when should we start a family? I mean, there's just so much of this that anyway, but I think this is part of going back to the Shema. We're called to love the Lord our God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And so much of Christianity in the modern period has been reduced to the world of the spirit, which is good, but not at the expense of the mind. We're supposed to balance mind and spirit. So that was masterful, Putty. I don't think you intended to do what you did, but it was great. Let me ask you this before we run out of time. So, we all three of us are vineyard guys in our roots. So this is a little bit of a curveball, not a question you would commonly hear bandied about at all in a vineyard context. But sure. As you think about yourself and you think about what are often called the fivefold ministry gifts found in Ephesians 4:11, and for those who don't instantly reference that, apostle, prophet, evangelist, pastor, teacher, which of these do you think you are the nearest to without actually making the claim that I am that? Since a couple of those are on the no-fly list in the vineyard world.
Yeah, I would say, Putty, before you answer, how much of that vineyard thing is bristling right now?
yeah. No titles.
That's right.
That's so funny. Oh man, that's a great question. It's interesting. A few years ago, I think I used to give this subject more thought, and something about this last couple of years, I don't know. I think I actually just care less is one thing. So I'm like, actually, why would I want to settle for what? Profit? Like, profit is restrictive. I want to be Putty. Like, it's like, I want to be who Lord made me. I don't want to have to fit in any box, even if it's a shiny, attractive, charismatic looking box or whatever. So I'm caring less about that, but I mean, it's a biblical thing. So I don't think we should blow it off. We just need to position it rightly within us. I'll tell you, I typically get labeled as a teacher first. And I think there's some merit to that. I think I certainly have a teaching gift. And hold on, I'm getting a phone call. Go away, spam risk. So I typically get labeled as a teacher, and I think somewhat of that's because people often interact with me first in a teaching context, and some people find my teaching helpful, apparently. I've had a number of prophets call me an A word, which, you know, that's not my choice to make. That's really the Lord's choice to make. So, you know, I think honestly in this whole process, there may be some kind of an apostolic thing I'm growing into here. I mean, depending on how you understand that role, pioneering and church modeling new ways, that might fit right there. I don't know. But like I said, I think I'm just thinking about it less. I'm actually more excited about the ministry of the Spirit than the fivefold ministry these days.
Yeah.
So,
you know, I think that's ultimately where John Wimber got to. People would say to him, you know, you're an apostle. Surely you're an apostle. And he'd say, well, I may function apostolically, but then he would say, really, I'm just a fat man trying to get to heaven. Yeah. So he stopped thinking about it and he just, you know, did what he was doing.
Yeah. Yeah. So, you know, I don't know. I don't know. You guys want to tell me what you think? I'd be curious what you guys think. On the air here, we're vulnerable.
No, I think what you said was accurate in terms of what I think about you. But the other thing, and this actually leads to the next question I was going to ask you. So right. You and I were together in Chicago. You'd come up from Champaign. And I think this was 4 years ago, might have been 5. But David Wagner and I were ministering. And we were in this basement of this Catholic church, you might remember.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And David gave a word to you about giving you a generation. And I don't remember all of it. You might remember it even better than I do. It wasn't my word, but he said that you would, if you would accept it, God would give you a generation.
Hmm. Yeah.
So that sounds very apostolic, and there's no question you're a teacher. And I don't think the two need to be mutually exclusive. But so here's the question on that one. What do you think it means to be given a generation? How are you leaning into that word? And what is your vision, not only for your own millennial generation, but the one behind you, generally known as Gen Z or iGen, I think is the other one they're calling it these days. Talk to us about that. And maybe that dovetails into the little bit about, you know, apostle and teacher.
Right. Yeah, man. So first of all, yes, I absolutely remember this prophetic word. It's probably I shouldn't even say probably. It's easily the most significant prophetic word and the most central prophetic word in my life at this point right now. I review that word often. I pray through that word often. And I feel like ever since that word, I have been on a 5-ish year journey or whatever it's been of the Lord growing me into it. There's a lot of ways where at this point, a lot of it has felt like that, that one passage in, I think it's 1 Samuel, where it says, you know, the word of the Lord tested David. You know, it's like he was anointed king, but he wasn't allowed to be king. And, you know, that tension tests you. And so I think the first segment of it, honestly, it was fascinating. It was me saying, Lord, I am giving you the biggest yes I have to give, but I can tell that I actually don't even have a yes big enough for that word yet. It was like, it's weird. I don't even know how to say that, but it's like that word is actually bigger than I am. So the yes required to that word is a bigger version of me. And I'll give you every bit of yes I've got today. Like, I'm not waiting to give you the yes, but I know that you need to make me more for that word to have a yes that matches the size of it. And I've felt myself in that process actually over the last number of years. Fascinating thing actually happened with that word just 2 or 3 months ago. I know we have a mutual friend in Leif Hetland. Love Leif. He's become more central, I think, in my journey over the last couple of years. The Lord's really highlighted him, and we've had more connection. He has every year kind of a private, like sort of his internal network conference type gathering, and someone invited me, and he welcomed me, and so I went this year. It was in Colorado in a couple of months ago in April. And he was there, and I think his spiritual son, Paul Yadao, was there, and some others. And Heidi was there too. And I'm just sitting there like, I'm there to just kind of worship and love people. Heidi's up praying. I'm not even thinking about anything, or she's up ministering. I'm not thinking about anything. Ministry time happens. I hear the Lord say, go pray for people. I'm like, sounds great. Didn't need the help. I'll do that. I'll do that whether you tell me to or not, Lord. So I'm out praying, and I pray for a bunch of people. I do that for maybe 20 minutes, 25 minutes. And the Lord says, okay, you're done praying. So, oh, okay. And I just have the sense of the Lord's like, go sit down. I want to talk to you. Okay. So I just kind of find some place over here. I sit down. I start praying. And while I'm praying, that word comes to mind. Because the beginning of that word, you'll probably remember as I say this, David began that word saying, this is a moment for you, like Heidi Baker had a moment where the Lord asked her, do you want the nation of Mozambique? And then he proceeds, the Lord is saying, do you want, generation or whatever it was, right? So I had never given that little preface a second thought as to whether it was meaningful or not. I was just like, oh yeah, it's an example. I've heard that story, that gives me what I need. Well, I'm sitting there praying, and the Lord's like, do you think it was an accident that Heidi was in that word? And I was kind of like, no, I never really thought about that. That's really interesting, and here I am in a Heidi Baker meeting, which I've been in like 3 in my whole life. It's like tremendous respect for her, but we just haven't been in the same room a lot often.
Right.
And so I have the sense of the Lord like kind of being like, Heidi is actually a part of that word, like coming to pass.
Yeah.
I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, Lord. And then I have this thing where I feel this thing and kind of come up in me that's like almost this temptation to try to ask Heidi to pray for me for that word.
Yeah.
And I just have the sense it's like, nope, I need to not do that. I like this word belongs to the Lord. I can't make this happen. This is the Lord's to make happen. So I'm sitting there, I'm turning all of this over, and I just go, Lord, I give it to you. No one needs to pray for me. Like whatever you're doing is what needs to happen. I don't need anything you're not doing. I don't need anyone famous to pray for me. If you make it happen, it'll happen, whatever. As soon as I pray that prayer inside, just to myself, I don't say anything. As soon as I pray that prayer, Heidi's across the room. She beelines for me. And like 20 seconds later, she's got her hands on me praying for me. And I'm like, wait, what? Like she was over, like she was doing something else. She just like, she turns, she locks on me. She beelines right to me, gets her hands on me, prays for me like 5 minutes. And I'm like, oh, wow, this is absolutely crazy. And then, she's off doing her Heidi thing. And I don't know precisely what all that means, but I do believe there was sort of like a first season of that word coming to pass, which that transition has recently happened, I don't know what it keeps meaning, but I think there's a degree I've grown into it. There's a degree the Lord has incubated me in part of it. And I'm just trusting that he'll keep bringing it home, whatever precisely it looks like, if that makes sense. Now, as far as the second half of your question, what does it mean to have to be given a generation? What's my vision for millennials and da 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 da? Man, those are all good questions that I wish I felt like I had incredible answers to. What does it mean to be given a generation? That I don't know. I just got to be straight honest. I don't know. I'm praying for it. I'm saying, Lord, if that's what you're doing with my life, I want it. I don't know what it means. What I can say is like for the generation, millennial and Gen Z and iGen generations, I think it's true that a lot of the way that we're seeing these generations sort of fall away from the ways of the Lord.
Yeah.
I think it's because the Lord won't let us go back to the old shape. I'm like right on the cusp of the millennial thing. Like, I remember when my first friend got his first email address. Like, I remember that moment, like my kids will never, like they grew up in a world where all that was established, but like I'm on the transition. And so it's like, I can see the world as it was, and I can see the world as it's moving towards. And I feel like the millennial, actually it's the Gen X millennial transition. That is that line. And so these are actually like the first two generations that are sort of native to some new shape of the world that's happening. And what I am very passionate about is that that does not need to be a godless world. That does not need to be a world. Honestly, I actually think God's big enough that he's probably in and to some extent behind this change and this new shape. The new shape is actually way more compatible with the body of Christ than the old one. As Paul talks about it, where there's an eye and an ear and a part, and you're all one body, and all of these things, that's actually the shape of the world that's being birthed. And so what I am really passionate about the millennials and Gen Z is we actually have the opportunity to be the inaugural generation in a new shape of the world and establish here's how Christianity works in it. And Christianity is an important and a vital piece in it. In fact, my dream of my dream, and this is probably so out there, it's ridiculous, but my dream of my dream would be this. The last time the shape of the world changed this dramatically was with the Renaissance and the Reformation.
Mm-hmm.
And in the middle of a world that was getting just swirled in every direction, this crazy monk Martin Luther goes, hold on, that new shape of the world actually has theological grounding. It's not just that we're going to try and build around individuals and whatever. He's like, no. Individuals are made in the image of God. This is theologically meaningful. This isn't just we like individuals now and we hate whatever, was before. So Martin Luther actually steps in at the exact right moment, and he provides a theological undergirding of the emerging values of the West. And that theological undergirding plays forward into whatever, capitalism and democracy and, all of these different things. But he provides a meaning that is actually theological and Christian in origin. And I think that's one of the best examples of discipling the nations that I can imagine. My prayer would be that some version of that happens with the millennial generation, that in the new shape that emerges, it's actually given theological meaning. It's it's meaningful. It's not just, oh, we have the internet now, so we can do things different. It's no, this is actually spiritually meaningful. And these are the sort of undergirding principles that we can live in this new shape of the world according to the way God's doing stuff, not just by figuring it out by humanism and all those kinds of things. That would be my dream for our generation.
That's a big dream, but I think it's a God-sized dream. I think you're going to get it. That's what I think is going to happen. I think you're going to get it. So
maybe, Lord.
Well, Putty, we're about out of time. People want to connect with you further. What website should they sign on to, or how else are you reachable?
Sure.
You're going to give out your personal cell phone number?
Google Putty Putman is probably the easiest way. I have puttyputman.com will probably come up, and that's the easiest way. I've got some experimental stuff out there with Church Next, which you can probably find if you look hard enough. But the most helpful, meaningful stuff will be on puttyputman.com. And, you can find me on social media and all those kinds of things too.
All right, cool. Let me just say this before we go for all of our listeners. Putty and I are going to be speaking together at a conference that Orbis Ministries is organizing. This will be next year, not 2022, next year. But again, when you've got a bunch of in-demand speakers, it's tough to get calendars to line up. So Putty and I will be speaking. Dr. Jack Deere formerly of Dallas Seminary, but he's better known for his work in the prophetic and the miraculous. He'll be speaking. Craig Keener, who's the foremost theologian of miracles in the Western world, at least within Protestantism, but I actually think within all of Christendom. He'll be one of the speakers. Kim Moss, who also is a doctor, and Chris Reed, who has been on this show and he's probably got one of the most highly developed gifts in the word of knowledge, and he's known as a prophet. We will all be together next year, and the dates will be October 18 to 21. City isn't settled yet, but anyway, it will be by then. And again, we're just throwing the date out there early because this podcast gives you a sense of the quality of what that conference will be about. And it'll probably sell out. So just be watching for details as that comes forward. Putty's going to give, well, I'll do some talking with him, but Putty's really going to give the opening talk. And this conference is about the miraculous and the prophetic. We don't have an exact title yet, but that's the subject matter. And, people keep talking about quantum physics and stuff with Christianity, but part of why I want Putty to give the opening, the keynote talk is within modern physics, there's something known as the unified field theory. It's never been proven yet, but everybody's looking for it, and everybody is pretty much in agreement that it exists. They just haven't proven it. So this will unite, strong and weak nuclear forces, electromagnetism, et cetera. Well, Putty's a physicist. He's more qualified to talk about that than anybody, but he's a Christian as well. So we're going to tee it up with that kind of interaction. And if you're interested in prophetic, you're interested in the miraculous, and you're also a thinker, this is a conference you won't want to miss. You'll want to get on a plane, fly to wherever we end up holding it, or drive, or whatever, whatever they say. What is it? Crawl, walk, or run, but get there however you need to. Again, the dates are the 18th to the 21st of October, 2023. So anyway, with that, Putty, you want to close us out in prayer?
Yeah, sure. Jesus, I just thank you for this conversation. It's so exciting to be where you are and watching what you're doing in this beautiful world. I thank you are King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and your kingdom is well at work in our world and in our day. God, we just give you these things. We give you these dreams. We give you the things we perceive you doing. And we say, more than anything else, we want to be smack in the middle of your kingdom activity, Lord. Thanks for this friendship, too. It's fun to talk. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, gents, for joining. And thank you all for listening. We will be right back here next week with another fresh episode of God is Not a Theory with Kingfish.
We've recently updated the Orbis Ministries app with Ken's free teaching archive. You can click on the link in the description of this podcast to download today.